And we're back. Greetings, everyone. This is Lucian Vâlsan, broadcasting from Cluj-Napoca, Transylvania. As always, alongside with me is Herr Jon Gunnarsson, broadcasting from Deutschland, and our producer James Huff, making sure everything works just fine, broadcasting from the States and eating a steak. Greetings, gentlemen.
It's good to be back. It's been a while.
It's
as
been
always.
a while. As always, yeah, and it's going to be again be a while because next week at this hour I'm going to be spying progressives because they've made the unfortunate mistake of allowing me to be part of the media covering their Congress. They're so gonna regret this, but anyway, they allowed it, so I'm gonna honor their invitation. Yeah, how's been the weather lately?
Kind of meh. It's been sort of mostly rather cold, but some good days.
Yeah, I witnessed all the seasons, I guess, all the seasons in the last 2 weeks. When I left Kiev on Sunday evening. When I left Kiev, there were -4 degrees Celsius and already snow on the floor. And when I arrived in southern Ukraine, in Chernivtsi, there were 27 degrees Celsius and it was like midsummer. And then I crossed the border into Romania where there were like 10 degrees Celsius and it was raining. And then I arrived back in my hometown where today, for instance, there have been 24 degrees Celsius during the day and about 12 right now. So yeah, I've seen in the last 2 weeks, I've seen all the seasons. So it's really weird. Nevertheless, at least I didn't have to bear too much extreme cold, but still horrible weather in the Ukrainian capital for most of the time. I stayed there for a week. Only 2 of the days were acceptable enough to get out. All the others were horrible weather, constant raining, and yeah, it's pretty much like in the Soviet military. They don't fuck you, but they don't leave you alone either. It's just a continuum of jerking around. So yeah. Right, we have a relatively long news section for this episode. I guess somewhere within the normal for this show. It's neither too long, but neither a short one either. So I guess we can start.
Okay, the first story is from the Daily Mail, but it's about France. Men will be fined on the spot for wolf whistling women under strict new harassment laws in France. Men will be fined on the spot for wolf whistling women on French streets, the country's women's minister has said. Marlene Schiappa, 34, a feminist and early supporter of French President Emmanuel Macron, is trying to tackle sexist male attitudes in public spaces with new legislation currently being piloted. Men will be fined for lecherous, aggressive behavior or anything deemed harassment under the policy. But the definition of harassment and the amount of money harassers will be fined have yet to be decided upon. Quote, "It's completely necessary because at the moment street harassment is not defined in the law," she told RTL Radio today in a major interview to outline the law, which is to be voted on next year. The escalating scandal over Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein's alleged sexual assault on a string of actresses has rekindled debate on sexual harassment and predation in France. The Me Too hashtag, encouraging women to share their experiences, is among the top 10 trends on French Twitter. A new one has emerged. Balance ton porc, expose the pig, to report sexual harassment in the workplace. Asked about the difficulty of drawing a line between harassment and flirtation, Schiappa replied, "We know very well at what point we start feeling intimidated, unsafe, or harassed in the street." She cited examples such as when a man invades a woman's personal space by talking to you 10-20 centimeters from your face, or follows a woman for several blocks, or asks for a number 17 times. A cross-party task force composed of 5 MPs has been asked to work with police and magistrates to come up with a definition of harassment that can be enforced by officers on the streets. "The level of the fine is part of our discussions," Schiappa said, adding that neighborhood police would act on complaints brought to their attention by women. "The symbolic value of laws that outlaw street harassment is very great," she said. The legislation will also include provisions such as lengthening the amount of time women have to lodge sexual assault complaints dating from their childhood and toughening laws on sex with minors. Raphaël Rémy-Lelieu of the feminist organization Aussi le Feminisme, Dare to be Feminist, said, "I hope that social tolerance will decrease after people become more aware of sexual harassment. But there's a lot of work to be done." Eh.
Yeah, that's a very appropriate reaction. Now, first of all, a lawyer's perspective, this is a nightmare because no matter how they will define it, if they will try to enforce it the way this individual feminist dreams about, that means France should get ready to pay a lot of reparations in the European Court of Human Rights, because no matter how they will define it, there's just no way this can be consistent with the ECHR Charter. And sooner or later, sure, it's going to take a few years until the first complaint works its way through the European Court of Human Rights system, but sooner or later, someone will eventually be fined because potato and will win a case, and then get ready. Then get ready, because uh, the while it may feel good for the feminists, I mean, there are still some structures of law on this continent that they still sort of do work the way we expect them to work most of the time. So I'm not really. I mean, I am scared a little bit for the short term, for the maybe 1,000 dudes who will be affected by this policy. But on the long run, it's bad all the way. Everyone loses. I mean, the taxpayers will lose, the feminists will lose, the politicians will lose. Everyone loses, and of course, it will put another how should I put it? Another wall between men and women. It will undermine the confidence between men and women even further.
Yeah, because I mean, the way it's described in this article, it's all very vague. Like this feminist says, we know very well at what point we start feeling intimidated, unsafe, or harassed in the street. So basically, it's thought crime or something like that. It's about how
crime.
it's about how the other person feels, and how, as a man, I'm supposed to know how the other person feels if you approach a woman on the street or talk to her or interact with her in some way. The way she feels is not just a function of your behavior, but it's a partly a function of behavior, but also a function of her character, of her upbringing, her genes, her whatever other influences she's had, and it's completely unpredictable.
Yeah.
And the whole point of having rule of law is that it's supposed to be predictable. It's supposed to know in advance that this particular behavior is safe, and this particular behavior might land me in trouble. But with this kind of, if the law is implemented in a way that at least this feminist wants it to be, then you can kiss that goodbye.
Yeah, and let's not forget that and it's not just how will the potential quote-unquote offender will know he is committing a crime, but how will the police officer know that a crime is committed. On the other hand, she has a point. The feminist has a point in saying, "Oh, we know when we feel." She doesn't know why she has a point, but she has a point from a legal standpoint, because France is that country where you can go to jail and pay a 10,000 or 20,000 euros fine because a woman felt unsafe because you looked the wrong way at her at the workplace. And if there is video footage that you looked at her and that's it, her word is evidence. I mean, this is already policy and has been policy since 2014. Now, admittedly, the most of the people charged with this law, most of them, of course, were men, managed to avoid being convicted because most of them were relatively wealthy and could afford good lawyers, who basically told the judges, "Look, you convict my client, and I'm going to bury you all under a lot of paperwork from the European Court of Human Rights." So for now, it has been rather toothless, and I guess that's her point, that the previous the already existent laws passed during the times of what was his name, François Hollande. Most of those policies have been in practicality quite toothless. So now they're saying, okay, we're going to lower the standard of evidence and give the police in the streets the power to fine on spot and determine if the crime has been committed or not. Now, good luck with that, because again, entire countries have been forced to change their laws for something more mundane, such as parking fines, because in some countries of Europe, the police had too much power. With these kinds of things, I don't think, no matter how they defined it, I don't think it would stand up a day in a serious court of law.
Yeah, and it's just it just takes a chainsaw to the whole idea of due process. I mean,
Yep.
policemen can just sort of write you up on the spot and just determine that you've committed this crime, and that's it.
Yeah, and we sort of accept that kind of judgment when it comes to things like parking fines, or I don't know, crossing on the red light as a pedestrian and things like that, where I guess in most instances, although not all of them, there have been cases in overturned in court. But in most instances, we can definitely trust that most of the times the officers will not just write fines because potato. And uh, nowadays, with street surveillance in most places, you can actually prove it. I mean, we do allow some of that power to police officers, but at least with things that um, everyone can agree that they are a bad thing. Everyone can agree how they can be committed. I mean, it's not like you can actually accidentally cross the red light or you accidentally park in the wrong spot for 3 hours. I mean, but with these kinds of very vague things, I mean, no matter how they define it, I mean, sexual harassment is still a crime in part of feelings. So giving
Yeah,
the
so
go ahead.
so maybe objectively the light has been green, but I sort of it felt red to me. So I'm gonna write you up now.
Yeah, it just doesn't work like that. Uh, but overall it's going to be a complete failure, but in the meantime just a few other thousands of men will be fucked around and forced to pay whatever fine it will be. By the way, it will have to be something rather small, because in France, just like in my own country, there is a superior limit to which a policeman can issue a fine. And that limit is not really that high, so the fines will have to be relatively small. And as it's always the case when it comes to small fines, they can always be avoided, and then feminists will complain again, and they'll say, "Oh, we need to make it criminal because everyone is avoiding the fines, or they're paying it and consider it a good price." And when that will happen, they'll have to face up to the reality that they already have it as a felony, and it still doesn't work. And it's a never-ending circle, which will generate more and more whining from feminists. But that's pretty much it.
Yep.
Yeah. So good luck. All right. Let's go to the next one. The next one is a little bit more serious, and with the potential to piss off some of our audience. It will be like the first time we do that. Coming from the Daily Mail, what boy would turn down such an attractive offer? Judge slams female teacher who had affair with pupil 15 and performed sex act on him in her car as a birthday treat as she jails her for 16 months. A gifted young teacher sobbed in the dock as she was jailed for having a 4-month relationship with a teenage boy. Alice McBearty, 23, used social media to contact the 15-year-old, and the pair went out for meals together. She also bought him gifts, a court was told. The teacher kissed him in a classroom, took him to a hotel for sex, and performed sex act on him in her car and as a birthday treat in a garage. She also took the teenager to her parents' home in Manor Park, East London, where they had sex. At the Snaresbrook Crown Court, she was jailed for 16 months after pleading guilty to 7 counts of sexual activity with a child while in a position of trust. Sentencing Judge Sheila Canavan said, quote, "You engaged in a full-blown sexual relationship with a 15-year-old child. I accept he was consenting. What 15-year-old schoolboy would turn down such an attractive offer? I accept you truly believe this was a great romance. You were in love with him and vice versa, and that age didn't matter, but it did. You were supposed to keep him safe, to help him make the right decisions. Instead, you helped him make all the wrong ones. You knew better and you did it anyway. He was precisely at the age where he was at the mercy of his hormones. You breached the trust between student and teacher to satisfy your physical and emotional needs. This was the grossest breach of trust over a period of months." The judge described McBearty as a bright, intelligent, and gifted young woman who knew right from wrong, but said she had committed the grossest breach of trust. Judge Canavan called her conviction a spectacular fall from grace. McBirty, who appeared in court dressed in black with her hair tied in a ponytail, admitted to having a sexual relationship with the pupil between February and May this year. The court heard that the relationship began when McBirty sent the boy, who cannot be identified, a friend request on social media. Prosecutor Lisa Matthews said, quote, he woke up one morning to see a friend request from Alice McBirty on Facebook. He felt special and accepted it. She messaged him asking for his number. They unfollowed each other, but then she messaged him again and they started following each other on Instagram. Dates began with the pair acting as a couple, going for strolls and out for meals. Miss Matthews said, quote, he appeared to be besotted with her, close quote. Several members of the staff raised concern that McBirty was getting too close to the pupil, but the affair continued. The court heard the pair had several sexual encounters, starting with the petite blonde took the youngster to her family home during the February half-term break. On other occasions, she booked a room at an Ibis hotel in London's Docklands for sex and performed sex acts in a garage and in her car. She also kissed the pupil in a classroom at the school. The relationship unraveled when the boy's father went to the police after obtaining his son's telephone records. The pupil was interviewed by police and social workers and admitted the affair. His father said the family had been terrified about the impact of the case, not only on his son, but on the family's honor, the court heard. Emma Shafton, defending, said, quote, this is a young lady who has had a spectacular fall from grace, university educated, comes from a respectable family. She has been utterly disgraced by this, close quote. She told the judge her client is not sexually attracted to children, but added she will, of course, be branded a pedophile for the rest of her life. She is a sex offender. The barrister said McBirty had been thrown in at the deep end after joining the profession through the Teach First fast-track training scheme and soon detested her job. She added she was low at the time. She was asked to teach subjects she had no experience in. This is why instead of socializing with her colleagues, she socialized with the students in the classroom. McBirty has resigned from the teaching position. Ms. Shafton added that while on the bail, McBirty has not been able to get a decent job that matches her qualifications and instead has been delivering parcels for Amazon on a 0-hours contract. McBirty pleaded guilty to the offenses at an earlier hearing. So, go ahead.
Yeah, so
you do the controversy this time.
Okay, so I will start with something that's non-controversial. That's if this had been a man, the sentence would likely have been quite a bit more severe, and we certainly wouldn't hear comments like, I accept you truly believe this was a great romance, and I accept he was consenting. What 15-year-old schoolgirl would turn down such an attractive offer? If it was a man and a girl, we wouldn't be hearing this, obviously. That said, I don't really see that any great harm has been done to this boy.
Yep. In fact, the sentence, taken it stripped from its context, is pretty much the sentence that would have been handed in my country, except for being branded a sex offender. We don't even have that concept here, because here is, if you're 15 and she's 23, that's fine as long as she's not your teacher. If she is your teacher, then it's a problem. 16 months would probably be a bit too much. She would have probably gotten maybe 12 or 13 months here, and of which she would have served 3, maybe. But in general, if she had not been her teacher, this would not have even been a crime in significant portions of Europe.
I'll tell you what else you wouldn't hear. You wouldn't hear how the poor woman isn't able to find a job to match her qualifications.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. If the defendant had been a man, no one would care if she couldn't find a job, for sure.
But, well, it's obvious we do know what she is qualified for.
Yeah. Quite frankly, what I don't like, and I really don't like this tendency amongst many MRA circles, thankfully not all, but a significant portion of them, is this extreme aggressiveness to these kinds of cases, especially when the quote-unquote victim is 15, 16, Yeah, no, sorry, no, it's just not the way it is. Now, admittedly, I also apply the same standard when the victim is female, quote unquote victim is female, and also 15 or 16. I apply the same standard. No, 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 she wanted to, that's fine. Yeah, maybe it's a breach of ethics. Maybe because if the defendant is the teacher, maybe there should be some repercussions. But come on, a pedophile, give me a freaking break. No, that's simply not the case.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a breach of trust and sort of an abuse of authority as a teacher, and she certainly should be fired from her job. But I don't really know if this should be a criminal concern. Now, the age of consent in the UK is 16, which is, I think, the highest in Europe.
Yep.
And I think it's too high. I think what would happen.
Sorry, it's not too high. It's not the highest. But Ireland has it at 18. Of course, nobody abides by it, but
okay, so Ireland seem higher, but yeah, definitely. I think it's sort of that's something that I really dislike about, I guess, the Anglo-Saxon or English-speaking culture, when, both in the UK, in Ireland, in the United States, and various other English-speaking societies, you have these unreasonably high ages of consent.
What are you talking about? Up until not too long ago, there were still states in the United States that had age of consent laws at 12
and 7.
And there are still states that have it set at 14.
14 is fine. Lower than 14 is trouble, but 14 is fine. I think 14 should be the standard. And 14 is globally the standard. I mean, in China is 14, in Switzerland is 14, in Austria I think is still 14. Spain was at 14 until very recently.
But I'm not too sure that we can actually compare today's 14-year-olds as compared to 14-year-olds, say, in 1850, 1860.
Why?
Because they're 14-year-olds in 1850 and 1860 were having to take on a hell of a lot more responsibility than what we're ever giving these kids nowadays. They understood what life and death consequence was, a hell of a lot more than what a lot of today's Western children are. So, personally, the age of consent laws as they stand, as long as they're followed, fine. I don't think this woman should have been labeled whatever she's labeled, if the age of consent law was not broken. As long as that law remains there, just stick to it.
Yeah, well, I don't believe that at all. I think in such situations, especially when it comes to 15-year-old. I mean, come on, this guy is what, 15 years old and 10 months. So if she had slept with him 2 months later, suddenly would have been more mature. And give me a break, please. And again, I don't like this particular legal hysteria of labeling anyone. I mean, in the United Kingdom in particular, this is the case. I mean, if you're 17 and your girlfriend is 15, you're suddenly a pedophile. Give me a break, please.
No, I get that there's a gradient to human development here. I understand that. But look, you got to draw the line somewhere. Either that or have a means of testing and every individual to see how mature they are and have an age of consent by an individual level. And you can't do that right now. We don't have the technology to be able to do something like that. So, that's why we have these laws in the first place, and that's why it's kind of black and white.
I mean, I agree that you have to draw the line somewhere, and it's impossible or very impractical to judge everything by case-by-case basis, because then you have no sort of legal security. But I just think that 16 as an age of consent is too high. The question is not, is it a good thing for a 15-year-old to have sex, or is it something we approve of? The question is, are we so sure that this person is being harmed in a very major way that we're willing to use the force of law to throw someone in a cage for having sex with that person? And there, I think with a 15-year-old, the case it's clearly no, because a lot of 15-year-olds genuinely do want to have sex. I mean, 15-year-olds are sexual creatures. They're sexually mature, and having sex is something that 15, 14 years olds have been doing throughout human history. It's fairly normal human behavior, and to say that this is so obviously wrong that we're willing to make it illegal, we're willing to throw people in jail for engaging in this normal human behavior is just unjustified, in my opinion.
James's argument that the 14-year-olds of the 1850s had more responsibility for themselves and sometimes for others than the 14-year-olds or 15-year-olds of 2017 Western Europe, it's a very sound argument. It's the first time I'm hearing it, and the more I think of it, it's quite a decent argument. I suppose self-evident. I mean, your average 16-year-old was having at least his or her first child in the 1750s, and in the rural Europe way until the 1850s, 1860s, and probably even later than that. So in that comparison, definitely the 15-year-olds of today are less responsible and at least outwardly behave less mature than 200 years ago.
Well, we keep them children.
Oh yeah, sure.
I mean, nowadays we keep them children
in many ways. Yes.
So these kids who were growing up, these young men who were growing up by the age of 9, they were shooting 300-yard shot at buck here in the U.S. This was back in the 1850s. This was regular. If you weren't doing that and you were a country boy, something was really wrong with you.
Yep.
And by the time they're 14, 15 years old, they are getting ready to take over that plot of land that their dad is still running, because their dad's thinking about stepping down in another 5 years. Son, you're gonna have to take over where I'm retiring here, because I'm not much longer for this world. And dude might only be 45, 50 years old by the time that happens. So we've got this increased life expectancy. We've got a much increased length of adolescence, and how we treat our children and the responsibilities and duties that we provide them. And these age of consent laws were written 100 years ago in most cases. 100 years ago, when we didn't have such an extended mental adolescence in our society. Now, do we want to argue then about the age of consent and where it should be when today's 15-year-olds might as well, for all intents and purposes, and life experience? Yeah, you understand where I'm going with this.
I understand your argument. I don't think it applies to such a broad range. I mean, you're having in mind a particular type of individual, the urbanite who's never seen nature at all by the age of probably 20. You have a particular typology of human being in your mind, and for that typology, definitely your argument is very, very sound. But these laws are supposed to be applied across the board. And the majority of the population, at least in Europe, it simply doesn't work like that. Not yet, anyway. Maybe they will in the future, but not now.
Okay.
And the same would be true in the United States. I mean, you're telling me that in the rural Indiana are the same social rules as downtown New York? Come on, please.
Oh, no. I mean, I grew up in the 80s, and by the time I was 11, 12 years old, I had a shotgun in my hand. That was no big deal to me.
There you go.
I was going out and shooting things and skinning and cooking and everything else.
There you go. I mean, I made a video about that, saying that most of my childhood will be illegal today. I mean, someone needs to put a brake on this legislative advance of things, because yeah, sure. On one hand, as you say, we keep them children for longer, and we prolong this mental adolescence. But on the other hand, the law is facilitating all of this nonsense and making sure that the next generation grows up slower, I guess.
Yeah. By removing the types of tools and opportunities that parents would normally have to be able to pass on these things at a younger age. I get that. I do. I get that.
Jon, you
So,
wanted to say
so
something?
a couple of points. So, first, sort of, as a point that's, I guess, in support of James's thesis is that there's a lot of evidence that the whole idea of adolescence is more of a cultural phenomenon than something that is sort of biologically determined. There are a lot of there are some cultures that sort of non-Western cultures that don't even have a sort of concept of adolescence where teenagers do not act in a sort of reckless and irresponsible manner that we typically associate with teenagers, where they take on a lot more responsibility a lot earlier and a lot more mature even at earlier ages. However, I don't. As far as the whole concept of sexuality is concerned, I don't know if really today's teenagers are more immature in that regard than teenagers 100 years ago. Teenagers today have access to internet pornography. They have they're a lot more educated about matters of sex and sexuality
Look,
than.
it's one thing to understand exactly what the shocker is, or two in the pink and one in the stink. It's one thing to know a thing, but another thing entirely to understand the consequences of an action. And back, I want to say back in the day, but I'm going to say that because you all know how far back I'm talking about. But back in the day, consequences were very real and often very immediate.
Yeah, and in today's consequences are no longer as severe because we have, condoms, we have various other methods of contraception to prevent teen pregnancy, and
Yeah,
we have abortion and so
those
on.
are all physical consequences. Yeah, we get that.
So
But
at least the physical consequences of sex are a lot less severe today than they used to be, which would argue for lowering the age consent, not increasing it. I mean,
no, I have a very different view on the matter. It's the mind, not the body.
yeah, I mean, and I get that, but
and in this case, I see that the lack of physical consequence, or the physical consequence, the threat of physical consequence, is often what propelled the mind into a broader understanding of the mental consequence as well. That's not happening now.
And it's also true that we no longer even have, as a general rule, European concept of that would be the equivalent of what's it called in the Jewish law, bar mitzvah, the coming of age. There used to be something like that, at least symbolically, as though either the confirmation or the baptism or whatever. Every single subculture of Europe had its own way of dealing with something like that. We don't have that, and now we have. And the whole concept of coming of age has been blurred severely, and for some people coming of age comes at 13, 14, for others comes at 25 or sometimes even later than
back
that.
in the 80s, you had your sweet 16 birthday parties.
Mm.
A lot of girls had those anyway. Hey, sweet 16 birthday party. That was kind of the coming of age moment.
Yeah, but let's not compare with the non-Western. Let's compare with the Netherlands. I mean, in the Netherlands, you have free condoms from the age of, I think, 13 or 12, something like that, or from secondary schools for sure. They're available either for free or for the astronomical price of like 5 euro cents or something like that in vending machines. And the whole legal structure of the state recognizes that teenagers have been, are having, and will forever have sex. So they always ask the question: how do we do to mitigate the potential the potential negative consequences, rather than prevent them from having sex to begin with? Because the understanding in the Netherlands is we cannot prevent them from having sex. We just cannot. No matter how much we try, we cannot. They have the opposite of yes we can mentality. They have the mentality of no we cannot. So the instead the state, the society asks itself how to mitigate the the consequences in such a way that it reflects as little as possible on the rest of the society and on the individuals in question. And it seems to be working. I mean, they have a much lower teen pregnancy rate than the United Kingdom, much lower STD infection rate than most of Europe. Someday someone will have to ask the question, what are they doing right and the rest of Europe doesn't, or the United States for that matter?
I guess they're just recognizing human nature.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, it's one thing to discourage, say, 14 or 15-year-olds from having sex. I have no problem with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But just to sort of implement a law that says, anyone who has sex with this person will be thrown in a cage, I just don't see how that's justified.
Especially considering that after decades of applying this kind of policy, I mean, this policy is in place in the United Kingdom since Queen Victoria, so since 1870s or something like that. It still hasn't decreased the likelihood of teenagers having sex. If anything, it sort of increased. I mean, the teen pregnancy rate is much higher today in the United Kingdom than it was 60 or 70 years ago. Now, I'm not saying this particular policy was the only one that would contribute. It definitely wasn't. But I am saying that once you look at the situation a little bit more coldly and less emotionally involved, and you just look at the numbers, one has to conclude that the policy is maybe not the best idea in the world.
Yeah, and also, I mean, you also have to look at the consequences of that to teenagers who are denied the opportunity of having sex. I mean, to maybe to some of them, it's an experience that ends up being somewhat unpleasant or maybe even traumatic, but to many others, it's also a very pleasurable and very enjoyable experience. And you have to sort of weigh these up against each other and to find some sort of reasonable cutoff age where you say, anyone below that age is very unlikely to have a positive experience with sex. And so these people are just so young that we can say with very high probability that the experience with them will be bad and traumatic, and then I guess it's justified to throw the other person in jail. But to put that cutoff point at 16 or even 17 or 18 is just unreasonably high. It just does not properly take into account the realities of human nature and human sexuality. And I mean, if you do this sort of comparison to 1870s or 100 years ago or whatever, you actually have to take into account that back then puberty sets in later. Yep. So in particular for girls, the age of menarche in the last 100 years increased, where it's been lowered by I think over a year on average. So that's a huge change. So
and almost the same for boys, yeah. And it's because of better food, essentially, better alimentation.
So teenagers today become sexual creatures even earlier than they used to be in 100 years ago.
Once again, I have to make this distinction between, and this will be my last word on it, because I know we got to move on. I have to make the distinction between what the body is prepared for and what the mind is prepared for. And while I do understand where you're coming from with the Netherlands taking a more prepared approach to an understanding of how to mitigate the consequences of these actions. Yes, let's do that. But I do have to point out, just because physically you are entering this period does not mean that your brain is keeping up with what's going on. If anything, it's the exact opposite trend has occurred mentally with these people. The opposite trend has occurred. So, yeah, they might be experiencing physical puberty a year earlier, but they aren't experiencing anything even close to actual adulthood until 3 or 4 years later than their 1850s counterparts.
Mhm. So essentially, the argument is teenagers have become more physically adult earlier than 150 years ago, but have become mentally adult much later than 150 years ago.
Correct.
That's your argument is.
That's my argument.
If I may have another parallel, and then we can move on, beatings in schools. Now, I would dare to argue that having an affair at the age of 15 is far less traumatic than being beaten the crap out of your by your teacher at the same age of 15. The amount of harm that can be done to one's self-esteem by being publicly humiliated in front of his colleagues by a professor at the age of 15, which is still legal in the United Kingdom and in many, many other places, is much higher. Yet the latter has either stayed legal or has been at best somewhat punished, in the sense that, yeah, the teacher might get suspended, maybe fired in very rare circumstances, but it was never tackled. Even in the societies where it has been phased out from the schools, it has never been tackled with the same vigorousness as the instances of teenagers engaging in what I would call normal human behavior. That's very interesting. And okay, in the case of the United Kingdom, I guess we can chalk that out from the Victorian era, because basically the Queen Victoria was much less concerned of teenagers being beaten the crap out of, or even killed, sometimes killed by the state, but she was very concerned with their sex lives. So maybe in the United Kingdom it was the exception, but what about everyone else? I mean, the beatings in schools were cracked down upon much less severe than this issue.
Yeah, and also like physical punishment in schools was legal in Britain up until I think the late 80s. So it's not exactly ancient history.
Yeah, and in private schools it's still legal today. I mean, the parents get to sign something, and it's still quite practiced today. Not in all schools, not in all private schools, of course, and it's of course kept a little bit hush hush about it, but it's still practiced. And
Yep.
it's not a huge scandal. I would argue that it should be, but it's not. All right, let's go to the next controversial story. Oh boy, this one is wow.
Okay, coming from BAZ Online from Switzerland, municipalities can force paternity tests. Municipalities are able to challenge a man's recognition of paternity. The federal court has partially sustained the complaint by the city of Winterthur and the municipality of Flumsdorf. In the case in question, a Kosovan woman gave birth to a child in September of 2010 after she had been divorced from a Swiss husband. Around a month later, the Swiss man recognized the child at the registry office of Winterthur. Thereby, the child inherited the father's citizenship rights in Flumsdorf. In the following year, the Bureau of Migration of the Zurich canton cancelled the woman's right of residence. The Bureau determined that the bond between the Swiss man and the Kosovan woman, between whom there was an age difference of about 30 years, had been a sham marriage from the start. Nevertheless, the woman managed to retain her right of residence after an initial appearance in front of the federal court, because the child is a Swiss citizen and she therefore has the right to live in Switzerland. On Thursday, the federal court decided in a public consultation that municipalities do have the right to sue against the recognition of a child. According to the federal judges, this right to sue is absolute and does not depend on a weighing of the interests of the child and the public. At this stage, the question of what it means for a child to no longer have a legal father doesn't have to be decided. As was explained in the public consultation, the relevant passage in the Civil Legal Code had been implemented to prevent abuse, such as getting citizenship rights and the consequences of that. The revocation of paternity in this case had failed so far because the man refused to provide a sample for a DNA test. The Upper Court of Zurich had considered compulsory DNA tests to be illegitimate. The District Court of Winterthur will now have to determine the child's genetic ancestry. If necessary, it will have to order a forcible extraction of a swab of the purported father's cheek if he continues to refuse the test.
Right. So this is a really interesting case. So basically, the baby is an anchor baby, and the Kosovar lady married a sugar daddy and then divorced and presumably had his child. And nowadays, now the state has figured that one out, but it's a bit too late for them. So instead of saying, "Oh well, we got here a little bit too late, tough luck," they're like, "No, no, 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 no. We're gonna fight it to the bitter end and contest the paternity." I think it's the first time, or it's definitely the first time I'm hearing of the state disagreeing with a man when he says, "Yep, that's my kid." Wow, this is really interesting.
Yeah, it's a really interesting case, and has a lot of interesting implications.
Mhm.
I mean, this man. If it is indeed a sham marriage, then I guess he's guilty of some sort of crime, and therefore I guess they can maybe justify forcing him into a DNA test. Still, I'm not quite sure how to feel about that. And also like the whole thing is this child was born in 2010, so let's say 7 years ago. It's grown up in Switzerland for 7 years. It's at this point, I guess it's shouldn't it be considered too late to get rid of the child? Child has grown up in Switzerland for 7 years, hasn't seen Kosovo ever.
Probably never.
Probably doesn't speak the
My
language.
question is, has she been receiving any kind of state benefit over
Probably
this
not.
period of time?
Probably not.
If not, then just leave it the hell alone. You see what I'm saying? If she's not
Yeah.
costing the money any state, just leave it the hell alone. Let her be. Let the
Yeah,
kid be.
The thing is that let's assume the test comes out negative and this sugar daddy is not the biological father of this kid. Then what? I mean, really, then what? Deport the kid and the mother back to Kosovo? Really? What if the kid doesn't even speak Albanian, which probably he doesn't? Uh, I mean, it's not really uncommon. I mean, I know quite a few Swiss dudes who have Albanian names and they don't speak Albanian.
And what if the father has a relationship with that child?
Yeah, and then that. I mean, it would be quite the state intentionally creating negative consequences into the life of the child for no reason, essentially, just to make a point that, but it's really unclear what the point even is.
It's punishing the child for the parents having a sham marriage, according to the state. That's what it comes down to.
And besides, having a sham marriage, since when is that necessarily a crime? I mean,
Oh
considering
yeah, yeah. I mean, what? Everybody must marry for love. Yeah.
yeah, that's actually quite a new concept. I mean, sham marriage.
That's what I'm saying. Some of the greatest empires on the face of the planet were built out of marriages, marriages, and families who, in most cases, would have slit each other's throat on the street.
Yep. I mean, I don't know. It's really weird. And if the test comes out positive, then the state would have wasted all of these resources because in the end, it's nothing that really they can do. I mean, the kid is the legal and biological child of a Swiss citizen. Therefore, the kid is a citizen, and for as long as he's under 18, he gets to have a relationship with his mother. Therefore, the mother cannot be deported, and by the time the kid will be 18, the mother will have stayed enough in Switzerland to have gathered enough legal years there to apply for citizenship anyway or for permanent residence, and everyone just wasted a lot of time and taxpayers' money for nothing. No matter how you put it, the taxpayers are losing from this.
Yeah, and I think this sort of points to some of the weaknesses of immigration law. That this, like, if we assume that this woman has a job, is supporting herself and her child, then I don't really see any problem with her remaining in Switzerland, even if she maybe got in with the sham marriage or whatever.
Thing is that in Switzerland you cannot access welfare if you're not a citizen or at least a permanent resident, and you don't get permanent residence status very easily. I mean, even if you're married, you first get temporary residence, and it's a very complicated way to become a permanent resident. And even then, it's not sure you can access welfare. That's why, as I'm saying, she probably didn't cost the state any money. She probably cost the sugar daddy quite a lot of money, that's for sure. But then again, that's private arrangement. It's not the business of the state, or at least it shouldn't be.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of my point. I think that immigration law should protect the country's taxpayers from basically freeloaders, from people who come to the country and who don't work, who may become criminals. But if it's productive members of society who work, who support themselves, then I think I see no good reason for ejecting them. I mean, especially in the case of this child who's grown up here, who's grown up in Switzerland, who probably only speaks German. It's just a no-win situation.
Mm-hmm. No matter how you look at it, the taxpayers lose. If the test comes out negative, then the taxpayers lose because there will be a bitter, long legal battle which the Kosovar mother will win. If the test comes out positive, at the very least, the leak of public shekels stops now, and only the money wasted so far remain wasted. Either way, the taxpayers lose. It's not. I mean, I understand the point of making sure to avoid the immigration fraud and whatnot. But if they were really that concerned about that, then maybe they should have introduced right from the get-go a paternity test. When this guy went to the registration and said, "Yes, I recognize that's my kid," maybe that's when they should have. Oh well, in order for we to agree with you, we need a biological sample, and let's test it now. That would have saved a lot of headaches and would have also put into practice the the policy of the more hardline anti-immigration hardliners. Because I'm fine, I'm an anti-immigration hardliner myself, but if you can do it with the minimum amount of friction, especially for the taxpayers, because as you said, the immigration law first and foremost should protect the taxpayers more than the feelings of anyone else. But in this case, it doesn't. In this case, it wastes taxpayers' money on a case that is already pretty much lost right from the get-go.
Yep.
Right. Let's go to the next one.
Next one is from Germany, from Merkur. Couple is violent toward each other. He has to appear in court. She doesn't. Because a 32-year-old Slovak man abused his then girlfriend physically, the contract worker from Bad Tölz had to appear in court. The defendant had contested the order to pay a fine of 1,800 euros, so the matter had to be settled in court. The backstory. As the couple was visiting a club in Rottach-Egern, the defendant's 36-year-old life partner complained about pain in a recently operated upon arm. Since he didn't pay attention to this fact when dancing, as the Slovak woman wanted, she wordlessly got into a taxi and went home. Thereupon, the defendant slept in his car and returned to the couple's flat in Bad Wiessee the next morning. The girlfriend, visibly enraged over her partner's absence, asked him to immediately leave the flat. The man agreed to this, but wanted to pack food and clothes first. According to the testimony of the Slovak physician's assistant, however, she had paid for both from her own money. For this reason, she became violent, punching her boyfriend in the back and kicking at his leg. A scuffle across the flat ensued, during which the woman tore off the man's necklace, which resulted in bruises across his neck. He didn't take this lying down and proceeded to slap his partner across her face with the flat of his hand 3 times. Hence the charge, deliberate intentional bodily harm. Asked by Judge Leitner whether and why such incidents occur frequently, the defendant replied it was due to his Slovak temperament. Quote, "I don't want damages, I just want this to be a lesson for him so he doesn't do it again," the injured woman said. Since the incident, the two have been separated but are trying to maintain friendly relations. The Slovak man's repentance is considered a mitigating factor. Additionally, the plaintiff had also shown a potential for aggression. For that reason, the penalty was reduced from 1,800 to 1,600 euros. The defendant used his last words to apologize. and I hope to be able to avoid losing my temper in the future. End quote.
This case is schizophrenic. So they beat each other, and he gets to pay a fine to the state. How does that make any sense?
Yeah, not really sure about that.
I mean, it would not have made any sense if you were forced to pay her some reparations, but at least it would have made half sense. But the state, I mean, how was the state harmed in all of this? I mean, these two individuals had a physical fight on private property, so it's not like anything. The state had nothing to do with it. The state wasn't injured in any way. So how is the state the injured party that gets money from all of this?
It doesn't make a lot of sense, but I don't know.
As for the misandrist bias, yeah, no points for pointing out leftist hypocrisy. I mean, come on, seriously, it was a mutual fight, as are most domestic violence incidents. In this case, since they both have a temper, probably they should be both sent to some, I don't know how would you call it, some counseling or whatnot. Maybe they should work out some anger management.
Yeah, that's the word.
Yeah, they both seem to have a temper, and they both seem to have a problem with maintaining coolness. If the state is to do anything, that would be probably it. To send them to some anger management and get over with it. I mean, this is really, really weird.
Yeah, and it's I guess a great example that as a man, if you're physically attacked by a woman, you should not fight back.
Yeah, the only legal option is to let yourself killed by her or something.
Basically, the best thing you can do is just try to avoid any sort of blows and just get away from the situation, because there's no way you can win.
Run away! Run away!
Yeah, basically, it shouldn't be like that. It should be that you should be able to defend yourself if you're attacked, but the thing is, in the current legal system, it doesn't work, because, I mean, this man was defending himself. She attacked him first, and he hits back. And still, he's the one who has to pay the fine, and she doesn't.
I wonder how cheap would be an involuntary manslaughter. And I'm only half joking, because if you remember a few years back when we had that Spanish feminist invited, at one moment she said that essentially in some areas of Spain, when that insidious the ley against the gender violence law, when that monstrosity was in force in some areas of Spain, it was much cheaper to accidentally kill your wife than to get one more round through the women's court. So I'm only half joking when I'm asking how much would be an involuntary manslaughter. Because seriously, I mean, in this case, of course, they both have a temper. Probably they work it out. Maybe he'll pay the fine, maybe he won't. Who cares? But in other cases, these kinds of things happen for so long, and things get much more bitter. And I wouldn't be surprised if sooner or later someone will ask this question very seriously. I mean, I don't live in Germany, so I don't really have to care. But sooner or later, in some cases, maybe this will be a serious question. I mean, this is what feminists never think about when they applaud these kinds of monstrosities or help pass policies that allow these kinds of legal monstrosities to occur. They never ask the question, what are the consequences? At what cost?
Yeah, it's very important that the sort of penalties are staggered in such a way that that worse behavior gets a worse punishment, because otherwise, as you say, at some point it will be cheaper to kill your wife than to slap her or something like that. Or and that situation you definitely want to avoid, because then you get in a situation where if you've hit your wife, then you have nothing to lose, essentially.
Yeah, and I'm not saying this would become generalized. I mean, it didn't become generalized in Spain, but I'm saying in more extreme cases, instead of having a severe fight, and wounds heal and bruises heal. But I haven't heard anyone healing from being murdered. And instead of having severe wounds or maybe some bruises, you'll be having more dead bodies piling up and more jobs for the homicide division of the police department. It doesn't even have to be generalized. It's enough if it happens maybe 3 or 4 times a year in a country as big as Germany is. Would it be quite a huge shock?
Yeah, I'm reminded of a story from Chinese history where during a particular period you had the influence of the philosophy of legalism, which basically the idea is that you have very severe punishments for all sorts of infractions, with the idea that if you have extremely severe punishments, then you don't actually have to enforce them very often because people just be too scared to do anything wrong. So you had in the military, you had the punishment if you're late as a general, you arrive late, then off with your head, you'll be killed. So a general was delayed because of bad weather or something like that. So he turned to his second in command and asked him, "What is the penalty for tardiness?" "Death," he said. And then he said, "What is the penalty for rebellion?" "Death," he said. And so rebellion was born.
Yeah.
That's sort of the kind of thing you invite by that, because if someone has nothing to lose, then it becomes very dangerous.
Yeah. It's sort of a cliche, but it's still true. I mean, never mess around with the man who doesn't have anything to lose. It's quite true. I mean, and this kind of thing with the rebellion, these kinds of things happened again and again, even in recent history. I mean, for instance, in the former Soviet Socialist Republic of Georgia, the same thing was. I mean, you would go 20 years in a gulag for publicly contesting the regime, but then you would also go 20 years in the gulag for working around the rationing law and buying 3 breads instead of 1, or things like that. So that convinced enough people to publicly contest the regime. They were like, "Oh, what do we got to lose?"
Yep.
Oh, they're gonna fire at us. Who cares? Right, let's go to the next one. The next one is a little bit hysterical, and in the end is just like, yeah, we told you so. Coming from the NRK, the state Norwegian television, police about juvenile violence, girls are used to carry weapons. The girl carried a gun in the bag for a young man who participated in a gang fight, so says the witness Gulam Farid Khan. The police in East Oslo are concerned about an increase in violence among young girls. Now, I was very lazy, so I didn't translate the article, so you'll have to excuse me if I'm going to have interruptions while reading it. Anyway, in recent days, NRK has written about an increased level of violence among young people in Oslo. This issue has also reached the schools, where a teacher was injured when a teenager grabbed his throat and inflicted life-threatening injuries on the teacher. Ghulam Farid Khan was last Monday a witness in a fight with firearms. He aimed low, says Khan, showing how the teenage boy held a gun with straight arms and pointed to his legs. NRK meets him on the spot where he and some friends stopped an event of gang violence outside the Vestli subway station. It was about 20 individuals that flew on a boy and hit him. We got out of the car and tried to stop them, asking them, "What the hell are you doing? 1 against 20? They hit the boy in his head," the witness says. 5 or 6 teenagers were most active and hit the boy, according to Khan, while others cheered on. He estimates that there were 16 to 18 years old. When the men broke in to stop the violence, one of the boys went into the subway station. He went to a girl who was waiting. I saw that he stuffed his hand into her purse and found the gun. He was quite calm, but with the gun in his hand, he became aggressive, says Khan. The teenager held the gun low and aimed at their legs, according to Khan, to threaten them to stay away. He alerted the police, who has secured surveillance video from the subway station, I guess. Yeah, T-Bahn station. A man was found on the evacuation images and is now arrested after the incident. He is charged with threats with firearms. I guess that would be the translation. Together with Mohsen Raja, Khan is considering launching a youth association in the eastern districts. Both say that boys deliberately let girls carry weapons for them to violent events, I guess would be your. The police go to the boys when they come to a fight. The girls sneak away with the weapons in the bag, so the boys are just left alone. It is known in these environments and they talk about it openly, adds Mohsen Raja. This issue is also known for Jarle Kulstad, the head of prevention section with the Stuvner police station. It is a phenomenon that we sometimes see that uh, those who are violent in the streets do not carry the weapons themselves. This applies to all sorts of weapons, including electric weapons and small firearms. It is in this context that girls are used to take their weapons, says Jarle Kulstad from the police. Also, the police says that the level of overall violence increased amongst girls. After a decline in violence among young people in general, the trend has reversed and violence has increased over the last 2 or 3 years, according to Kolstad. It shows both the number of it shows both in the number of allegations and feedback given by the community to the police from those working with youngsters. Violence has increased mostly among young people under 18 and especially among girls. Kulstad says boys still carry most of the violence, but the biggest increase we see among girls, both in terms of no, both in terms of, I guess, aiding and abetting violence and gross violence. We also get video clips that show that girls are increasingly violent to each other. They also hit and kick when the victim is down, he adds. His experience is that when teenagers with I guess with the violence issue spend a lot of their day at the school, violence comes into schools as well. It reflects in the community that there is generally more violence among children and young people. Of course, they bring this to schools too, Karlstad added. It became apparent that this became apparent to the rector, or I guess the director at Stuvner High School, who informed the municipality about violence and school threats after the start of the recent school year. The section leader reads some examples from the recent past with reports of violence at schools in Oslo, and then there's a list. A boy lit the hair of a schoolmate. Two girls have loosened the waist and hit a student hard with their fists in the head. A boy under the age of 15 uh, also broke someone's hand and nose. Three girls beat a companion, and they only received well, I guess a petition, a write-off, something like this. It's basically a slap on the wrist in terms of academic penalties. Also, the principal has been threatened with physical violence, and the students received only a probationary something. Also a slap on the wrist, essentially. The prosecution office states that some students are old enough to be punished, but the police choose not to prosecute them. Children under 15 are still not subject to any penalty. This increase may not apply to Oslo, but it is natural that we get an accumulation in the largest cities, Kolstad said. According to Gulam Farid Khan, the boy did not try to help and was and and did not oppose resistance when the doctor came in to treat him after the violent incident. This is back again to the incident described at the start of the article. This article is really not orderly. He had visible damage to his head, but he only stayed for minimum care and then went from there himself. He was a bit terrified. When we arrived here, he finally got some breathing time. Along with a friend, Mohsen Raja, he's now considering the possibilities of starting a society to help young people. The two tell them that they spend a lot of their free time talking to young people from the eastern districts, including the environment with a lot of violence and other crime. We've both seen these kinds of incidents even as young men, but we got out of it. Now we see something that we did not see when we were part of this, that a group of 20 youngsters could pile up on a single boy, added Raja. Now notice something missing from this article.
What?
there's nothing about the ethnic and religious background of these violent youngsters. We're
Yeah,
supposed
I
to.
was a bit confused by those names. Is the story about Norway, or are we talking about Syria here, or something like that?
It sounds more like Syria, and although if I am to be more precise, it's more like Pakistan. Every single individual except the chief of the police is Pakistani. Um, I mean, I don't know how much longer can this hold on, but seriously, I mean, if you are to know nothing about Norway and nothing about the eastern part of Oslo, which I do, I actually have some videos from there, but I cannot publish them because I sold the rights for those images. Anyway, the thing is, if you know nothing about this, you would read it and say, Norwegian kids are getting more aggressive all of a sudden. I wonder why that is the case. But it's not. It's just not. Uh, I'm not saying that there is no uh, indigenous Norwegian kid amongst those violent ones. Probably there is, but at this rate, it's probably not the case. It's more like the case of these. How do they call it? They don't even call it immigrant communities anymore because that's already politically incorrect. I don't even know how they call it anymore. But anyway, it's always in these areas where um, non-natives tend to congregate and tend to segregate essentially from the rest of the society. As for the
Yeah.
police being surprised that they use women to carry or girls to carry their weapons, why the hell are they surprised? I mean, really? Why is that such a shock? I mean, and this is probably the bigotry of low expectations. I mean, they don't expect the immigrants or the children of immigrants or whatever to figure it out that, oh, let's see, what is the main weakness of the police? Oh, yeah, they never expect violence from women. There you go. Let's bring all the girls here. I mean, it's just any criminal that is worth his salt is trying to adapt to the techniques of the authorities in order to avoid detection. I mean, this is just basic common sense in the criminal world.
Yeah. I mean, this trend is also there's another example of why I'm not in favor of equality. So we have here a situation where violence is becoming more equal between men and women, but is it a good thing? No, violence is generally a bad thing, and if women are increasingly being violent, that's a bad thing, even though it's more equal.
Yeah, yeah. But basically, it's the reason why you're not an egalitarian, I guess. Yeah, it is getting closer to equal, but again, most of this is happening because of the uh, conscious or unconscious bias of the police. I mean, this Pakistani guy. What's his name? Something Khan. He says that, oh, when there's violence, the police go first to the boys, and by the time the police gets to the boys, and they I guess strip search them. They find nothing on them, and well, who fired the weapon? And the boys are like, what weapon? Are you insane? And that's how they get away with most of these things. And they're basically, these little criminals are exploiting the biases of the police.
Yeah, and I mean, it does, of course, make a certain amount of sense to preferentially search boys because boys are more likely to commit crimes than girls. And I mean, you might call that, if you did this, by race, ethnicity, would be called racial profiling, and I guess
I'm all for
sexual
that, by the
profiling
way.
is
I'm
I
all
guess
for
more
that.
acceptable. Yeah, and I think I think it should be acceptable. It should also be acceptable to do racial or ethnic profiling if there's a good reason for it. Because if there's a particular race or ethnicity that is far more likely to carry out crimes, then it makes sense to search them more frequently, search them more thoroughly. That makes perfect sense to me, even though it's discrimination. But I don't care.
Yeah, well, we
Police
discriminate
should
every day.
discriminate. The police should discriminate between those who are likely to commit crimes and those who are unlikely to commit crimes. Perfectly reasonable.
Yep. But nevertheless, I mean, it will be. I guess we'll have to wait and see if the police will adapt to the new situation. And but if they don't, then this particular bias will continuously be exploited. And as you said, we'll get more equality, but not necessarily the one that that any
Yeah.
normal human would favor.
Equality is always the question: in what direction are you equalizing?
Yeah. Well, sometimes in both directions is bad, such as in economics. I mean, we cannot make everyone poor. Well, actually, we can. It's called socialism, but we cannot make everyone rich. So trying to make it equal in any way is bad. As someone from the Objectivist Institute would say, equal is unfair. So,
Yeah, I would actually disagree with that. We can make everyone rich. It's called capitalism. It's worked wonders, and
yeah, but
if
it's
you
not
use,
it's not equally rich. You see,
it's not equally rich, but it's transformed the
but
world
it's
from a
close enough.
situation
Yeah,
where something like 90% of people were in extreme poverty, whereas now it's like 10% over
yeah.
the last 200 years.
Yeah, I was reading a graph, and it took every single poverty line that, because every single institute has a different poverty line, and it took it from the highest to the lowest, and it said no matter what poverty line you choose for, under this amount, it's the global poverty line. No matter which standard you choose, there has still been the most spectacular decrease in poverty in the human history occurred in the last 25 years. No matter what your standard is. But anyway, back to violence, street violence. Uh, I guess this will be a case where the police will have to drop some of the biases and rather make some ethnic profiling instead of sexual profiling.
Yeah, but it just depends on what works, in my opinion. We shouldn't have some sort of automatic reaction against either sexual profiling or racial profiling. It's just a question of who is most likely to be criminal, who's most likely to be carrying weapons and carry out violence and so on, and should design your search pattern based on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but in this case, if considering that more and more girls are being used to carry the weapons for the future crimes, maybe there is a case for more broadened ethnic profiling and less of a sexual profiling, I guess, or sexual manner. Uh, I mean, if you're looking for weapons, it appears to be the case that more and more often the weapons are not with the boys.
Yep.
Right, let's go to the next one. Oh, we're a bit behind the schedule. Go to the next one.
I thought you were going to read that.
Okay, fair enough. Coming from the NY Post, the men's rights movement is on the rise in Silicon Valley. Women believe they have the right to lie, cheat, deceive, sabotage, to empower themselves in the workplace because they will always see themselves as having never have enough to make them happy at work, much like the average marriage. Everybody having or being shown equally is foreign to her. That comment was posted over the summer by a user on an online forum run by MGTOW, a radical fringe of men's rights movement that stands for men going their own way, and sums up how some men feel about the work environment that they say has become obsessed with gender parity and too quick to call out perceived sexual harassment by men against women. While MGTOW is an extreme version of the men's rights movement, its most ardent adherents avoid marriage, swear off having children, and limit their contact with women as much as possible. The sentiments expressed on Reddit message boards, online forums, across social media channels, and throughout the so-called manosphere show that an increasing number of men feel targeted at work. A growing population of men will refuse to subscribe to the utter nonsense perpetuated in the culture, the media, the magazines, on television, or in society at large, the MGTOW website states. They're passionately curious, will question everything, and are fundamental seekers of the truth, no matter how painful the truth may be. They are the men who will choose and prefer to go their own way, independent of what we are subjected to on a daily basis. One job sector where men's rights advocates have become more vocal is the tech world, which has been for years seen as a boys' club that has only recently, and in some cases grudgingly, accepted women into the fold. All of that is false, by the way. The conversations over workplace parity have taken on a new urgency amid a slew of high-profile sexual harassment and discrimination scandals that have rocked companies from social finance to Uber. Many male tech workers who identify as men's rights activists say they have felt like there is a witch hunt going on, and male employees feel like there's a gun to the head to be better about gender issues. Rebecca Lynn, a venture capitalist at Canvas Ventures, told the New York Times, a former newspaper. Despite the growing anger among MRAs, many have been hesitant to speak up publicly about their sense of being demeaned as morally inferior to women and disenfranchised when it comes to accusations of sexual abuse or harassment. At least that was until James Damore came along. Damore, 28, okay, this is the story, you all know the story of that. The Moore recently filed a complaint with the National Labor Review Board and is considering legal action, including a class action lawsuit. On the reverse side, 3 female former Google employees filed a lawsuit against the company, arguing women earn less than men in nearly every job classification. The firing of the Moore, instead of silencing MRAs in Silicon Valley, appeared to galvanize the movement. The founder of startup incubator Y Combinator, Paul Graham, posted 2 articles arguing that science behind Damore's memo, and startup investor John Durant wrote that Charles Darwin himself would be fired from Google for his views on the sexes. Investor Eric Weinstein tweeted, "Dear Google, stop teaching my girl that her path to financial freedom lies not in coding, but in complaining to HR." The increasing vocalization of sentiments like those espoused by the Moore worry many pushing for more diversity within the industry. LinkedIn founder Reid Hoffman recently asked investors to sign a decency pledge, and many other tech heavyweights are admitting that they could improve diversity within their ranks, but there is still concern about how far this movement will go. This year, Silicon Valley technology companies have been receiving some very good criticism on fairness and decency on gender, Hoffman wrote. This criticism is important. I welcome it. We should all welcome it and, of course, remedy it. One unfortunate side effect is that people think that many Silicon Valley technology companies have gender hostile environments, close quote. I had no idea LinkedIn still exists. So, and also I just learned that the New York Times, the former newspaper, is still around. I mean, it's like a zombie. It's still walking. It should have gone bankrupt a long time ago. Anyway, this is significant not because of the things presented in the article. I mean, the article is just the usual hit piece. The other New York newspaper, this one is the NY Post, allegedly the right-wing newspaper in New York, which actually has an almost identical article from the former newspaper, the Pravda on Hudson. The point is that whether they like it or not, there is, for the first time, I would say, the potential to have our own march through institutions on this. I predicted some of this when I made the video about the James Damore saga, that if played right, we can start our own long march through institutions. Now, of course, it will take time. Don't expect spectacular results tomorrow. But for the first time, the defenders of this whole diversity nonsense are actually having to defend their positions instead of just pushing them without any sort of resistance.
Yeah, this whole James Damore saga has been, I think, a very positive development. It's sort of laid bare a lot of the sort of hypocrisy and just sort of the anti-science attitude of this diversity at any cost crowd.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I mean, this article, obviously, there's a lot of errors there. It calls MGTOW a radical fringe of the men's rights movement when they're not the same thing. I mean, many MGTOWs are MRAs and vice versa, but they're different things. And there's many MGTOWs who are not MRAs and vice versa again. So it's that's like saying, I don't know.
The objectivists are a radical fringe of the libertarians.
Yeah, or saying that TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, are a radical fringe of the Democratic Party. Sure, there's an overlap there, but they're not all the same thing.
Yeah, many TERFs are definitely not Democrats. Many TERFs actually actively despise Democrats, just like many MGTOWs actively despise MRAs. But yeah, again, as I said, when it comes to sexual politics, the NY Post is only 9 out of 10 times wrong, whereas the former newspaper, the New York Times, is 10 out of 10 times wrong. So in most of the cases, they're just as wrong. And this is a stellar example of how the NY Post can be just as wrong. With that said, this is there have been several articles in the cathedral media, in the former newspaper, in the New York Times. Paul Elam was also interviewed for that article, and he was quoted in that article. The New York Times posted a much longer expose of this whole issue. Of course, reading that one would have eaten a significant portion of the show, so I didn't include that one. But nevertheless, this could be very significant, and it's developing at a very steady pace, and it's developing in the direction that we hoped for.
Yeah.
And especially the portion where significant figures in the dynamic world of technology come out with the things like, come on, by your standards, Charles Darwin would be fired from Google, or the other guy, the investor, dear Google, please stop teaching my girl that her path to success comes with complaining to the HR. These kinds of things are very, very nice developments.
Yeah, and I mean, the good thing about the memo is that it really is just sort of a standard science, and it sort of summarizes the sort of the prevailing notion, the scientific consensus among people who study psychology differences and gender differences between men and women. And the funny thing is that people on the left who like to tout this whole scientific consensus line when it comes to climate science, when it comes to the science of biological difference between men and women, and not so much in favor of scientific consensus.
Not so much, even though it's the kind of consensus that even the vast majority of the planet can also agree. I mean, when I see some of these, and I recently observed from a safe distance several leftist academics, the way they were like, oh, it is absurd to say that men and women are different. And I'm like, do you realize that you're just outside of the vast majority of the planet? I mean, the vast majority of the planet may not be scientifically literate, but I don't think there are too many people outside of leftist academia who would argue that there is no difference whatsoever between how men behave and women behave. And I mean, come on, seriously? And yeah, this anti-science militancy of the left and of the diversity crowd is slowly starting to unravel, which is great. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, that position on sex difference is just so absurd. It just makes no sense from an evolutionary perspective. Like, we know that men and women are very, very different in terms of their physiology, in terms of different organs they have, in terms of the size difference, in terms of physical strength, in terms of a propensity to contract various kinds of diseases. But somehow that's all of that, all these evolutionary pressures that must have produced these different outcomes, they just have no influence on the brain.
Yeah, even evolution stops at the neck.
Yeah, evolution stops at the neck. Even though we also know that male and female brains are physically different. There are differences in architecture, differences in size, but those differences apparently they're completely irrelevant. They don't have any sort of influence on behavior. Because I don't know, maybe behavior is not determined by the brain or something like that.
Yeah. It is the disease of egalitarianism manifesting itself here, because they pull the same routine when it comes to differences in behavior and interests and intelligence and whatnot between various races of people. They pull the same kind of routine that the evolution somehow stopped at the neck. Well, it didn't. And it at least in the lower tier kind of leftists, it shows that there is some fear in them rather than conviction. It's more like fear. But if we admit the difference, then that means it's going to give ammunition to all of those nasty people just refusing to understand that just because something is different is not necessarily mean that something is worse. It's just that it's different. It does things differently, and that's not a bad thing. I mean, aren't we all for diversity? Well, I guess not.
Yeah, I mean the argument
also, if men and women are the same, then why argue for diversity?
Yeah, they're basically interchangeable. Yeah. I mean, the argument for the egalitarian argument, as it goes for ethnic groups or races, is, I guess, a little bit more defensible, because there you can argue that evolution just stopped like 50,000 years ago or something like that, and since then we haven't seen any major changes, and that you can make the argument it's not true, but it's sort of not at least not absurd on its face. But with males and females, it's just completely absurd.
Yeah, it requires level 2 thinking to take that one down. Whereas with males and females, it's just really the vast majority of the planet can just see it right from the get-go. It's like, no, come on, that makes no sense. Right, this was a teaser for the silly place, so let's go to a silly place.
It's about to get a lot more silly. Coming from the USA Today, but it's about Spain or Catalonia. In Catalonia, women hope to build a feminist republic. In the 5 a.m. obscurity, Marta's and Laura's heavy eyelids are difficult to make out across a fence separating us, but nonetheless betray a sleepless night. The two young women are barricaded inside the Sandaru Cultural Center in Barcelona, a block away from the city's vast, palm-strewn Parc de la Ciutadella, so named after the remnants of a citadel built after Barcelona's fall to Spain in 1714, decisively ending Catalonia's self-rule. Along with about a dozen others sipping cups of coffee and speaking in hushed tones, Marta and Laura spent the brisk fall night at the center to prevent police from sealing it off before it could be used as a polling place for the last Sunday's referendum on Catalonian independence, which Madrid declared illegal and threatened to stop at all costs. Despite the apprehension, Marta and Laura, who didn't want to use their full names due to the technically illegal nature of the referendum, were quietly excited about the vote. Quote, "This referendum and the possible independence of Catalonia is a chance to break away from the status quo," said Marta, an engineering student. "In that sense, it's a chance to break away from the patriarchal repression we've always known. If women are part of this reconstruction of a state, we can achieve more egalitarian change," added Laura, an organizer at her neighborhood's feminist collective. "We're not saying Catalonia is better than Spain. This is an opportunity to change things, and what happens here will reverberate throughout Spain." Spain's crackdown on the northeastern region's October 1st referendum, in which at least 844 people were injured by baton-wielding and rubber bullet-firing Spanish police, as well as reports of sexual assault by these same security forces, has only confirmed what Marta, Laura, and the throngs of young Catalans clamoring for independence already believed. The current ruling order from Madrid is steeped in patriarchal violence. That's why they want to build a feminist republic. Spearheading the strive for a free and feminist Catalan state is the Candidatura d'Unitat Popular, the Popular Unity Candidacy, or CUP, an extreme left separatist party reviled by Spanish unionists and often viewed virulently by more moderate Catalans. The CUP has seen a meteoric rise to power over the last decade, from grassroots activism to securing 10 Catalan parliament seats in 2015. It vows to build a socialist, feminist, and ecologically sustainable Catalan republic. The face of the party is firebrand Ana Gabriel, who last year publicly denounced the sexist language often leveled at female CUP politicians in a video. "My name is Ana Gabriel, and I'm a slut, a traitor. I'm bitter, and I need to get laid because I want a free socialist and feminist Catalonia," she can be seen wryly declaring into a microphone, donning her trademark jeans, political t-shirt, and hoop earrings. This past September, she was once again the subject of controversy for assisting a group of sex workers in Barcelona in occupying a building to establish headquarters for their own collective. Though polls released prior to the referendum suggested only 40% of Catalans supported independence, the CUP, despite its perceived extremism, has managed to shore up unprecedented support over the years, largely due to Spain's refusal to negotiate terms for greater Catalan autonomy. Working alongside other secessionist parties, the CUP's habit of discussing Spanish colonialism and abuse using the language of gender violence and patriarchal hegemony has also gone mainstream. Sunday's events are likely to make more people adopt the rhetoric. In a video that has gone viral, a young Catalan woman recounts how Spanish police broke her fingers and groped her breasts while raiding the voting station where she was posted. Reports such as these are on the rise and prompted Barcelona Mayor Ada Colau on Monday to file a complaint against police for sexually assaulting civilians. The Spanish state and all of its institutions are patriarchal, and they're founded on the basis that men are positioned above women. And clearly the security forces adopt that patriarchal mentality, said the CUP's Clara Sanchez. In a situation like the referendum, where the Spanish state isn't upholding human rights and the security forces are infringing on those rights, women are most vulnerable to aggression. Patriarchy-fueled language far predates the referendum, however. In August, the CUP unveiled its final separatist campaign poster featuring an ostensibly working-class Catalan woman sweeping away overwhelmingly male representatives of Spanish power, church, crown, and capitalist pursuit, with a broom accompanied by the text, "Let's sweep them away." Last week, CUP lawmaker in Catalan parliament, Maria Boya, called the Spanish Prime Minister, Mariano Rajoy, an abuser, the term inescapably carrying domestic violence connotations, who wants to give us a beating. Catalans say Rajoy has consistently ignored the attempts at dialogue over the last few years and finally responded with swift and unmeasured violence this weekend. Independence then is a chance to start anew, free of an abusive relationship. "We're not going to magically have a feminist republic by leaving Spain," said Laia Estrada, a CUP city council member in Tarragona, about 50 miles down the coast from Barcelona. "But here in Catalonia, we can work towards feminism. We can fight for it." She defines a feminist republic as one, quote, "in which we put all of our efforts into ending the socialization of gender, where we share the workload, both productive and reproductive, and redistribute wealth. The sexual division of labor, where women are relegated to home and childcare without any kind of remuneration, is one of the central issues facing Catalonia in Spain," she said. "The CUP's feminism is intrinsically tied to its socialism. We live in a patriarchal capitalist system in which the accumulation of capital is at the heart of everything," said Sanchez. "The goal of feminism is to make life and people's well-being the center of all policy." Sanchez heads the party's Building Feminist Municipalities campaign, designed to end day-to-day acts of gender discrimination and make sure all policy is guided by an understanding of gender. The Catalan government said preliminary results showed an overwhelming 90% of the referendum's 2.26 million voters chose to make Catalonia an independent republic, but turnout was low at less than 43%. The Constitutional Court has ruled to suspend the Catalan Parliament session on independence, and the CUP and other pro-independence and other pro-independence parties called for on Monday.
Yeah. See, this is why I was never for Catalan independence. I mean, the second I saw it, I was like, "Oh, they're having a referendum again. Who's the organizer? Oh, this cancer. No, because no. Because no." And apparently, most of the Catalans also agree with me. No. Someone asked me, "Oh, but it's the self-determination of the peoples. Don't they deserve a state?" And I'm like, "No, communists don't deserve a state. Communists deserve a free helicopter ride." And because of this whole thing of the whole independence thingy, I mean, does not have a majority support, and probably one of the reasons it doesn't is because it is mainly pushed by very, very far left groups. I mean, the COP is just one of them, and by the way, this is not the most leftist group that you can find over there. It's the funniest one for our purposes on this show, but it's not the most leftist group. Some of them are even worse than that. As for her arguments, I mean, other than laughter, I mean, I got nothing.
So Catalonia is not better than Spain, but Spain is evil and patriarchal, and
Yeah.
it is actually better.
Yeah, but if we say it's better, then it's no longer egalitarian socialism, and
Yeah, then you're
that's
supremacist. You're a Catalonian supremacist, and that's bad. But obviously, you have to think that Catalonia is better than the rest of Spain. Otherwise, why would you want to be independent?
Now, if I were an agitator for the Spanish government, for the Madrid power, here's what I would do. I would send people to infiltrate these groups and tear them apart from inside. We're using the rhetoric that Catalonia is mostly white, southern Spain is mostly brown people, and as a result, all of these independence movements are essentially white supremacist movements. And we don't want white supremacy in our free and progressive Spanish state. So as a result, they all deserve to go to jail or be given free helicopter rides. I mean, if I were an agitator for the Spanish government, that's exactly what I would do. I would send people to infiltrate with this rhetoric. I mean, if they're going to use all of this nonsense against the normal majority, then probably it's a time that the normal majority fights back with the exact same tools, because it seems that they don't get the point through rational arguments. So When rational arguments fail, the only alternative to violence is to use irrational arguments. And if violence is so revealed, although quite frankly, I think the Madrid power was not violent enough, but that's probably because it's because of my biases. I don't think I think human rights apply only to humans, so not to communists. But that's my biases. So yeah, I mean that's what I would do. I would send people to infiltrate into these groups and tell them that they're essentially white supremacists.
Yeah, I don't know. the whole Catalonian situation is a mess. It's just,
of course, it's a mess.
So on principle, I'm very much in favor of secession, and I would like to see sort of Catalonian case as sort of as a test case, as an example of secession working in the sort of in the modern age, and hopefully can spawn secession movements in other parts of Europe. And that's also why I was in favor of a Scottish secession. But I mean, in this case, even to a strong extent in the Scottish case, the reason they want to secede is because the Spanish government isn't socialist enough, because it's because they even farther on the left.
And consider this, I mean, in the case of Scotland, it was a little bit more nuanced, but in the case of Spain, I mean, the Spanish government has consistently been amongst the most socialist governments in Europe. I mean, of course, the Greek one is by far the most socialist, but after Greece, Spain has consistently been very, very socialist. And the only reason they're slightly less socialist today is because of economic reality and economic constraints. And because, well, the Partido Socialista Obrero Español went full feminist retarded, and as a result, they lost the elections because of that. It was also the first time a political party lost the elections because it was too feminist, which was great. But yeah, I mean, as a general rule, I mean, they want to secede from a socialist country to become even more socialist.
Yeah, it's also like the whole way the sort of independence thing has been carried out by the Catalan leadership is sort of farcical, where the was it the president or who is called of the regional government sort of kind of declared independence, and
but not so much, not so enthusiastic.
It's sort of very unclear whether he actually declared independence or not, and then asked whether he had declared independence, he gave evasive answers, and it still hasn't clarified whether he actually has declared independence or not. It's it really is a mess.
Yeah, it is a mess, and probably I suspect one of the reasons this is the case is because it's the prime minister. The prime minister in Catalonia knows very well the same thing that I know, and the same thing anyone else connected to European economy knows, namely that yes, Catalonia was, it no longer is, but was by far the most prosperous region. But ever since the word referendum was pronounced, a significant amounts of capital have already fled the region even before the referendum took place. And then some more is fleeing already, and he's considering that, hold on a second, if we actually go through with this, not only will no longer be the most prosperous province in present day Spain, but will become significantly poor. I mean, every single relevant company has been pretty clear. If this whole independence thingy goes through, we're out of here. We're moving our headquarters to Madrid, and it's been nice meeting you. Because that's the thing that's mostly the case with most socialists. They assume that the current economic situation will always be the same or will only get better. It's the progressive mentality that things can only get better. They don't understand that they can actually get very, very worse really, really fast.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, you can take away rich people's money once, but once it's gone, it's gone. It's not like rich people aren't stupid. If you take away lots of the money, they will leave.
Yeah.
And rich people have the power to do that. They can easily move to another country, and there's lots of other countries who are willing to take them. Yeah. If you actually want to implement these socialist policies, you're going to have to tax the middle class and the poor people much more highly, because these are the people who can't easily move.
Yeah, and then the upper middle class will start moving, and then you will see like it happened here in the former Eastern Bloc, where even the lower middle class eventually attempted to move, and some of them did, some of them didn't, and in the end, it was the lower classes that collapsed the communist regime. The same thing will happen all over again.
Yep.
Because yeah, you can only take the rich people's money once, and maybe not even once. I mean, in these cases where there are so many months of uncertainty and whatnot, a significant portion of them will say, "The hell with this. Who cares what the end result will be? This is no longer stable. I'm fucking out of here."
Yep.
So they will lose only a tiny amount of money with the bank transfers and whatnot, and that's pretty much it. Yeah. So yeah, with the communists don't deserve a state. I'm not a big fan of secession movements, especially considering, especially when I look who funds some of them. I mean, in this case, most of it was not COP's doing, was the Podemos's doing, and Podemos is a political party funded by Tehran and Kremlin. So yeah, no, yeah, in some fairy tale imaginary principle, it sounds great. Secession, independence, freedom, yada yada yada. But on the other hand, it's secession, independence at the behest of the most murderous, evil regimes on the planet. So yeah, no, because no. Um, right, let's go to the last one. Oh boy, the last one. All right, I'll try not to laugh. Coming from the
Good luck.
Metro. All women deserve access to sex toys, even in poverty. Perhaps the idea that women who are living on low incomes, even in poverty, need vibrators might seem ridiculous to you. I'm very much hoping that you'll allow me to try and change your mind. As we told you yesterday, Poundland is releasing a range of sex toys which, as you can probably imagine, cost £1. The news hasn't exactly been elevated to breaking status. It's a funny story, a light story. It's no big deal. Only the thing is, accessible sex toys actually are a really, really big deal. Privilege plays a big part of how a woman experiences sex because a woman's class and education level defines how her sexuality is perceived. Women who have several degrees and dress in Dolce and Gabbana and have a lot of sex are seen as liberated. Women who live on council estates and do the same thing are slags. To become accidentally pregnant when you're an executive who is sleeping with a banker is unfortunate. A neat, discreet abortion is a natural step. But if you get knocked up having a sex with someone who's also out of work, just wait for the shower of judgment to start raining down. So much of what we've achieved in terms of sexual enlightenment is reserved for women with money and a high level of education, and it's just not fair. Sex toys are a huge part of that. The sheer number of high-end sex toy retailers is trying to tell you something, and I think that what it's trying to tell you is that women want to spend ridiculous money on sex toys. Women feel better about themselves if they are getting themselves off with a toy which costs £50. We've internalized this concept that by paying a lot for something, we've made it better. Buying an expensive toy is classy and chic and legitimate. It comes in a tasteful box and is wrapped in tissue, so what you're doing actually isn't dirty and wrong, but classy and elegant. In my experience, the majority of women experience some kind of guilt about masturbation over the course of their lives. Buying a toy and being able to confess to friends that you've done so is a liberating experience. Unfortunately, not everyone has that option, even if they might want it. We've got this idea that poor people should live off gruel and be grateful for it because they've dared to be poor. It's not a nice attitude, and it's one that we should all be trying to shake. Just because you're poor doesn't mean you stop being human. You still want to experience nice things. Buying a sex toy is, of course, an indulgence. No one needs a vibrator. No one would starve or die or fall apart if they don't have one. It's the very definition of a luxury. But little luxuries make all the difference to your quality of life. When you're living on nothing, luxuries are the first thing to go. Yes, you can buy a bullet vibrator for £9 at Love Honey, and it's a good bullet. But when you're really properly broke, £9 is a lot of money. Too much money. Which means that for people on extremely low incomes, the experience of using a sex toy is off limits. Or at least it was until Poundland decided to start making sex toys. I'm under no illusion about these sex toys. I'm sure that they who won't be as high tech or as powerful as a more expensive toy. But that's not really the point. The point is that it's a chance to put a foot into the game. It means that women who've been excluded from the conversation about sexual exploration can be part of it. It means that women don't have to put up with having crap sex and fewer orgasms on top of every other shitty things that comes from having no money. Nigh on no money. Good sex should be a right, not a privilege. All women, regardless of their background and income, should be able to experience sexual gratification. So good on you, Poundland, for recognizing it's not just rich women who deserve orgasms. Is it me, or we just witnessed a very, very far left collectivist socialist feminist praising capitalism?
Yeah, that might actually be the case. You know, if it were feministy inclined, I might have to call her a rape apologist or a rape supporter. Because I mean, she says that good sex should be a right.
Or a supporter of the capitalist patriarchy, an enabler of capitalist patriarchy, which is now profiteering off the misery of poor women who can't have.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, sex for women should be free. I mean, come on. After all, it's a human right for women to have good sex, and you know, if men don't provide that, then you know, obviously, the least they can do is provide them with free sex toys.
Yeah, and it's a human right for women to have sex, but only whenever they want it. If they don't, that's rape.
Obviously, I mean,
yeah.
Anything else would be rape. I mean.
Oh boy, it's really funny, and I think I'm gonna follow this author on Twitter because she writes this kind of disdainful nonsense all the time. It appears that she's paid to write all of this crap all the time. I mean, if you read some of her past articles, you're like, where the hell have you been? I mean, when I was lacking articles for the silly place, how come I didn't know she existed? Rebecca Reed is her name. So here's the here's a read up of previous articles. If you're on the pill, there's no reason to have your period. An official and unquestionable guide to the best couples Halloween costumes. Someone on Mumsnet suggests that saying you hate children is the same as being racist. Playboy appoints first ever transgender playmate. I mean, come on. If my future children don't like me drinking alcohol in front of them, they can move out. Don't date guys who won't buy you tampons. We tried Lelo's newest sex toy and it was confusing. Cum tributes the semen trend that you should know about.
Okay.
Our hoop earrings cultural appropriation. If you ever wanted to drink wine in the shower, today's your lucky day. As I was saying, this author is a gold mine for silly place content. I mean, if anything, this particular article is the most reasonable out of her previous writings for this tabloid. Well, I think it's considered a tabloid, I guess, Metro.
How many people have thought, you know, I'd like to take a shower and drink a glass of wine simultaneously? How often does it actually happen in the history of mankind?
Probably. I mean, I've had vodka in the shower, but I didn't consider that I need a fancy glass. I mean, you know, the bottle has a ceiling on it, and you know, you can just use that. Why bother with the glass? I guess you would need a glass with an umbrella. Come on, that's.
I mean, I can sort of understand this sort of if you're lying in a bathtub and you're sipping a glass of wine, I can sort of see the appeal of that, but in a shower, well, never mind. Let's move on. It's a very petty point. But I mean, this is a very petty article and a very petty writer, so I guess.
We're in the silly place in the last 7 minutes of the show, so please don't ask me to be serious. I've been serious the first 90 minutes of the show. Yeah. As for the core argument that all women deserve access to sex toys, I don't think there is any capitalist that disagrees with that. I mean, all capitalists would say, yeah, sure, if you can afford it, sure, not a problem. There should be ways for you to order it and have access to it, which capitalism has already provided, which is great.
I just don't see this. Why having access to sex toys is some sort of big deal. I mean, everyone already has sex toys that come inbuilt. They're called fingers. Women have them, men have them. They work just fine.
Yeah. Yeah, but I guess that's and we're no longer in the 19th century when you would say that washing your hands is in itself a task. I mean, it's not really that difficult to get your hands washed and enjoy.
Yeah. And also the idea that poor people can't afford £9 for a sex toy. I know poor people certainly seem to be able to afford a lot of money for booze and cigarettes. So a £9 sex toy, I don't know if that's really so unaffordable.
The cost of a Marlboro pack in Britain in 2016, last time I was there for the ICMI, was £9.99, so £10 for a pack of cigarettes. So £9 for a vibrator. I'm presuming that you're buying vibrators a little bit rarer than you buy cigarettes. It's not really such a big deal. It's just
Yeah,
not.
but if you buy the vibrator, what are you gonna smoke after?
Buy the vibrator this week and you smoke next week.
Oh boy.
Speaking of which, where the fuck are my cigarettes? But yeah, no, the whole argument is a bit ridiculous. Oh, the £9 is too much money and whatnot. I mean, if you walk for a long enough period of time through London, you can find £9 on the sidewalk. I mean, I found about £7 in 2 days. I wasn't actively looking for them, but I was like, oh, look, there's a £1 coin. So yeah, I mean, it's really not such a big issue. Now, of course, if you're reading this from I don't know, let's say Azerbaijan, then yeah, £9 is a lot of money. But from the United Kingdom, it's really not.
Mm-hmm.
As for the yeah, I wanted to touch on this. No pun intended. The class argument that women who have several degrees and dress in Dolce & Gabbana and have a lot of sex are seen as liberated, whereas those who live in council estates are seen as slags. Really, is that really the case? I'm not so sure. I mean, looking at the hashtag Me Too thing. I thought I was the only loon who was like, yeah, they prostituted themselves for very good roles and fame and money, and now they're complaining about it. I mean, come on, you accepted the trade-off. It's, I mean, you can't have slut walk and at the same time as complaining about it. I mean, you're either proud you're a slut or you're not. And apparently, I'm not the only one who feels this way. Apparently, anyone non-feminist thinks somewhere along these lines, as in, Weinstein is a slimy individual, but at the same time, those sluts shouldn't complain. So I don't know if it's really that that common view that women in higher classes, I guess, are seen as liberated if they're basically slutty. I don't think so.
I guess it's from the point of view of those higher classes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but who stops the women who live in council estates to see themselves as liberated too if they're acting slutty? I mean, really, who stops them? Oh, they might be judged. They might be judged by their peers, okay, but aren't the women in the higher classes also judged by their peers?
Yeah, but at least in sort of elitish feminist circles, that is sort of the attitude that I think this author quite rightly describes, and which
yeah,
doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I guess you're right. Although I would argue that in these elitish circles, yeah, they don't call you a slut up front, but they'll still judge you the same way poor people would judge you from behind your back. And sometimes you find out about it days or months later, and it's basically the same thing. I mean, people do judge each other, and I think we've made a huge mistake in cracking down on being judgmental. I'm of the opinion that if nature, or for those who believe in it, God gave you a brain, then you should be using it. And that means, yes, being judgmental. And yes, sometimes that's not nice. So what? I mean, all people are being judgmental all the time. It's not really something that's really that rare. And I don't think it is class dependent or education dependent. I think all people are being judgmental.
Yeah, nothing wrong with that. You have to judge people constantly to be able to interact with them, to be able to find your way around in the world.
Yeah, and we do
some,
find our way in the world through stereotypes and being judgmental and whatnot. I think that's really that bad.
Yeah, I mean, if you're judging someone who you don't know very well, maybe your judgment is mistaken. There's a higher chance of that, but it's still better than random. It's still better than the idea that I'm not going to judge anyone. I'm just going to assume that everyone is just a blank slate. That just doesn't work very well.
Right. One more point, and then we can wrap this up. Almost the final paragraph. It means that women who've been excluded from the conversation about sexual exploration can be a part of it. How were women excluded from this conversation to begin with? I mean, I doubt that women who will be buying £1 dildos will suddenly find the rush to write for magazines, or will anyone care about their texts to begin with. So if anything, the exclusion is not about whether you can afford a sexual toy or not. It's whether you're in the right circles to get your things published to begin with.
Yeah, that just doesn't make any sense. It's just complete nonsense. That sentence.
Yeah. Right. With that said, I won't be here next Friday because I'm arriving in the place where I'm going to spy the progressives very late in the night, long after 9 p.m., which is my time, my show time. But on November 3rd and throughout November, I'll be here every week. I'll be here in the sense at this YouTube address because I will not be here in this city, but I will be around the country where internet is great. Thank goodness. This is what I've been missing that while I was in Ukraine. So yeah, that's all of the things I have to say, but I know for sure you have one more thing to add.
Exactly. I would invite you to visit my blog, which is at orthogonalideas.com. And then I guess I'll see you in 2 weeks. And until then, take the red pill.
Take the red pill. Goodbye, everyone.